Hello, this is a re-recording of an event held by Historic Chevy Chase, DC on May 12th, 2020 at 7:30 p.m. It was our first live video meeting after many more meetings at the Chevy Chase Community Center. And we had about 78 people participating, which was, for us, a very large number. And the purpose of the event was to talk about how to do a house history and about the history of our particular neighborhood in Chevy Chase, DC. The presentation is by Carl Lankowski, who's the president of Historic Chevy Chase, DC. Carl and his wife Pam have lived in the neighborhood since 2010 on McKinley Street and have been resident in Washington since 1990. Carl, as you will soon hear, has a multidimensional understanding of the evolution of our city and this neighborhood in particular. He did that while he was working full-time at the State Department's Foreign Service Institute, where Carl had charge of European area studies. Just a few weeks ago, Carl retired from that job, and so he now has more time, not full-time, but more time to dedicate to leading this organization in our expanding set of activities. Carl has done a written history of his house that includes much of the material you'll hear in this presentation. And that is on our Historic Chevy Chase DC website. Right now, you're going to get an executive summary of that, along with some pictures, and also some explanations of the work that Carl did to assemble that history from various public records and interviews. So with that, I'm going to turn the screen over to Carl Lankowski, who will speak for 30 minutes more or less, and then we'll have a short discussion and end this recording. So Carl, welcome to this re-recording of your May 12th presentation.
Thank you very much, Chaz. It's nice to have had a couple of days to think about what I said the first time around. It was a pleasant surprise for us to have drawn so many people interested in the general topic of doing a house history. And we were thrilled to have some from 12 time zones away in Hong Kong. So let me just say that the approach that I'm taking here is a case study of my own house at 3506 McKinley Street. There are 13 slides. Each one focuses on a dimension or dimensions that you can develop in creating your own house history. Most slides not only raise questions, but also suggest sources. Some sources will be common to all house histories, others will not. Each house has its own story to tell and requires sources unique to itself. So let's jump right in. The first thing you probably want to know in developing a house history is what was there before, who owned the land. And for that purpose, we have Exhibit A here, which is a base map from around 1910. Base map simply refers to the man who ran the company that did these maps, Mr. Baste, William Baste. There have been other companies associated with other individuals at various times doing these, but the ones we're looking at were all base maps. And it's available in the Washingtoniana collection, which after the quarantine, you're free to visit at the Martin Luther King Library. Washington, D.C. is Central Library. And until then, you are in luck in the sense that some of these base maps are available online through the Library of Congress. And we have a link for you at the end of this presentation that I'll show. So let's take a look at this base map and see what we can see. Here, if you could follow my cursor, is where Chevy Chase Circle is. Here's Connecticut Avenue coming to Chevy Chase Circle. Here's Western Avenue going off to the northeast. And you see some streets that have lines in them, broken lines. That means that at the time this base map was undertaken, the streets had not yet been cut. So they were planned, but not yet real. And you can see from the red line, arrow here, Where exactly the house we're talking about is at 3506 McKinley Street. So you can see that there are several buildings already in existence at the time, around 1910 or thereabouts. One of them was a school here at the corner of McKinley Street and Connecticut Avenue. That's the E.V. Brown School, and that was built by the developer already in 1898. Not so much for people living in Washington, D.C., but for the new development that had already started north of Chevy Chase Circle. So people were coming from Maryland to enroll in E.V. Brown in the very early years. You will see other houses, including the Belt House, which was a house built in the 18th century. There was one way up here, just here, built by Corbin. So this was about 1910 because the Corbin House was built in that year. And this is a wealthy individual. The house is interesting because, among other things, the general of the armies for World War I for the United States, the commander of the American Expeditionary Force, General Pershing, Blackjack Pershing, lived here for a time after he retired in the 1920s. You'll notice that around the corner from the house we're talking about today, this case study at 3506 McKinley, on Broad Branch Road, there are a cluster of houses. I'm not going to talk about them now. I just want to highlight them for you because we're going to return to this cluster of houses before. So there were people living here close by around the corner before. They disappeared later, and we'll have occasion to talk about that. So you could see, among other things, also the property squares. The city designated squares. The house we're looking at now is in square 1996. You can see the adjacent blocks, property blocks all around it. Developers would then subdivide those blocks into lots and then sell them off to individuals to actually build houses. So those are some of the things that you can find out from these base maps. Let's talk about the house itself. Some of the questions that you'd want to answer are what style of house do you inhabit? When was it built? Who built it? Who is the architect? What kind of construction was it? Was it, for instance, a kit house, a pre-cut house that was delivered on rail and then built by either the owner or someone else? Were there additions to the house? All of these things. Now, what you're looking at here, Exhibit B, is the 1920 catalog of the Lewis Manufacturing Company from Bay City, Michigan. Lewis Manufacturing Company was a kit house company. There were a good dozen of the large ones of these companies competing with each other, including Montgomery Ward, Sears, Van Tyne, and a number of others that were all in this market. So the precursor for Amazon were these big catalogs that consumers could look through and pick out a house, and then in conjunction with a builder and an architect, adjust the model for their own design. Now, one of the things that's very charming about Chevy Chase, DC, is that the neighborhood was built eclectically by design. Eclectic in two ways. Eclectic in the sense that the houses were of different styles next to each other, and eclectic also in the sense that within each design from these kit houses, for instance, you can adjust the various features of the house in conjunction with an architect and a builder. This particular house is a bungalow, classic bungalow style. I'm going to show off some of my training as an international relations student. Also, the history of international relations told me that the bungalow came from an area within India called Bengal, and the two terms are not, uh, they're connected, in fact. So the East India Company, when it was formed, chartered by the first Queen Elizabeth back in 1600, sent off agents to India and to the Bengal area, found these habitations and then adapted them for their own purposes. When the Raj took over from the East India Company, that is, became an adjunct of the British state in the late 17th and early 18th century, these habitations were further developed and became part of the cantonments that were co-located with heavily populated areas that the Brits interacted with. So the interesting thing about these habitations is that they were brought back to the home counties in the British Isles in the late 19th century by people that were returning from public service for the British state in India back to the home counties. If you were wealthy enough, you could build a second home, a kind of vacation home away from the city. And many people took these as models, these bungalows, and built them along the Kentish coast at first. As the middle class developed in Britain, what happened is that more and more people were able to develop homes like this, and there was an increasing demand for them. That demand, however, was more or less artificially or politically or administratively, I guess, kind of closed off at the end of the 18th century because people like Lord Grantham controlled the property boards in the rural areas and were able to dictate what could and couldn't be built. So that being the case, and with a connection to the United States being rather deep at this time, the style jumped the Atlantic to the United States and was taken up where suburbanization was also occurring. First and foremost, where land was cheap, especially after 1908 with the advent of automobiles that became cheap with the Model T. And the place where that happened most was in Los Angeles. So Los Angeles became kind of bungalow city. And from there, the style was developed and it then rapidly became a style that proliferated wherever suburbanization was going on, including in Washington, D.C. So this bungalow was built in 1919. It was built by a local builder who had built many homes in the area. His name was Frank Gordon, and the architect associated with it was William Spiden, who developed a practice in the period between the turn of the century and 1933 when he passed away, operating first out of downtown Washington and then out of Manassas, Virginia. And we think that Spiden developed this house. He was a devotee of the arts and crafts movement. And he developed this plan and then sold it to Lewis Manufacturing Company. So he's connected to Lewis Manufacturing in this way and is listed as the architect in the permitting documents that we have. So Lewis Manufacturing picked it up, and this is, it assigned it the moniker of the Chevy Chase. So it's a Chevy Chase model, in fact. And again, it was built in 1919. We were celebrating the 100th anniversary of the house, which is why I wrote the history last year. The pattern that you see here in the catalog is, and the footprint is exactly what we still have, except for the fact that we added or our predecessors actually added a deck in the back. Other than that, the house is more or less exactly the way it was built in 1919. So let's talk a little bit about why the house was built here to begin with. It wouldn't have been built as an isolated event. So it was built as a part of a general development. Someone was behind this, and that someone was a person with a vision. Listed at the bottom of this slide are a couple of really important sources that you can get your hands on. The one that I relied on very heavily for the development and the vision of the person behind the development, Mr. Newlands, was the book by Elizabeth Lampel and Kim Prothero Williams, Chevy Chase, a Home Suburb for the Nation's Capital. There's a very good biography of Newlands by William Rowley from 1996, Reclaiming the Arid West, the career of Francis G. Newlands. So here's the interesting tidbits about Newlands. Newlands was a congressman from Nevada and then a senator. He died in office in 1917. Before that, though, he was already a developer. He got the means to be a developer because he went out west. He was born in Mississippi and moved to Washington, D.C., attended Yale for a couple of years till the money ran out, and then became a lawyer with a degree from the precursor of George Washington University. And like many people, went west to earn his fortune and seek his fortune. And he was successful in getting that fortune in San Francisco as a lawyer because he married wealth. He married the heiress of the Comstock lode, the great silver lode. And his father served a kind of undistinguished career as a senator from Nevada based on his wealth and connections in developing that silver lode. What happened was that Newlands became the estate lawyer, and very soon after that happened, not only did his father-in-law die, but his wife died, and so he became not only the executor of the estate, but the heir to the estate. And so he had tremendous amount of money toward the end of the 1880s. And with that money, he was free to do pretty much what he wanted. And he was in ideology a progressive. He wanted to become involved in politics at the national level if possible, and did that by following his father-in-law into politics in Nevada, first, as I said, as a congressman, and then later on following him as a senator. But before he got those, he wanted offices, he began developing the land. And his father-in-law had already bought land around DuPont Circle and developed a little bit of it. But Newlands had a grander vision. He knew through his contacts that the Washington, D.C. was about to get its own Central Park. It was called Rock Creek Park, of course. He knew, therefore, that the land west of the park was going to be immensely valuable. And so what he did with that knowledge is begin buying up land west and east of Connecticut Avenue, graded Connecticut Avenue, and built a streetcar from the boundary of the federal city, which was at that time Florida Avenue, all the way out to Chevy Chase Circle and beyond 2 miles into Maryland. And this development that he had in mind was to be a progressive one. In the same way that he started doing that in Nevada, he developed this land with all the latest infrastructure. It was part of a, back to nature, plein air type of movement in the United States and in Europe to get away from the grime and the congestion and the health hazards of the cities. So this is what suburbanization was all about. So it was to continue to be of the city, connected to the city, uh, and still distant enough from the city so that you can enjoy the fresh air. And this was done for the upper crust, for wealthier people, of course. So all of the great, um, you know, uh, improvements of the time, electricity, telephones, sewerage, indoor plumbing, were to be part of this development. All the modern technologies. And the first homes were built north of Chevy Chase Circle in Maryland, and these were opened in 1892. And it wasn't until 1907 that the developer moved south into DC proper and started developing the lots in that area. So that's how the development was designed. Uh, how was Newlands able to control his development and control his vision? Well, because he was immensely wealthy, he was under less pressure than other developers for actually selling at the market price what people are willing to give for the lots that were subdivided. So he could hold out until people agreed with him to develop along the lines that he had in mind. So he and his board of directors of the Chevy Chase Land Company were able to do that through a set of restrictive covenants. Now, those restrictive covenants were not racial at first. They were later, but at first they had to do with what kind of property you can build, how close to the street, the setbacks were mandated to provide a park-like atmosphere. Again, connected with all of these technologies that I mentioned before. Again, this was before the private automobile by 20 years, really. So this was a streetcar development, and that was what was unique about this development. It wasn't built alongside of a railroad line. It was the railroad, so to speak, was built for this particular development. Now, one of the restrictive covenants also is that the house that you were building had to be designed in a way that was in conformity with the wishes of Newlands. And the first model houses were built by his co-directors on the board of the Chevy Chase Land Company. So they were all on board, so to speak. And they all agreed to spend at least $5,000, which is a substantial amount at that time, for these houses. So this is how he was able to control. There were very few African Americans that were able to afford a house of that magnitude at that time. So the idea was to create a white enclave. There was no doubt about this. Newlands was a progressive in the sense that he believed in the application of science for public administration, and also at the national level, the mobilization of power at the national level to solve national problems, like bringing water to the West, which was what he was most associated with. But at the same time, he had racial beliefs that were consonant with many associated with both the West and the South. With the West, insofar as there were restrictions on who could immigrate into the United States from Asia, There were restrictions on Chinese, restrictions on Japanese, restrictions on Mexicans. And of course, there was a kind of latent coalition there with the South, because this is part of the whole Jim Crow era. Washington, D.C. was a southern city, and the tradition in the southern cities and the South more generally was racial exclusion. So this was very much something that Newlands agreed with. In fact, he thought and put forward a plank in the 1912 election. He was a Democrat for the nominating convention in 1912, actually to rescind the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, guaranteeing rights to all citizens of the United States. All right, so when the development of the Chevy Chase Land Company moved south of Chevy Chase Circle, here is when that happened, and here are the subdivisions within the development of the Chevy Chase Land Company. You can see that it was just south of the Circle was first, and on both sides of Connecticut Avenue. The one that we're interested in here is called Chevy Chase Grove 3, 1918. And the house we're looking at, if you can see my cursor here, is actually right on the borderline here at 3506 McKinley Street. This is a map that was drawn up. It was the study area for the Historic District campaign that Historic Chevy Chase DC was involved with between about 2004 and 2008. So another question that is interesting, now that you know that the Chevy Chase DC was developed and conceived of as a white enclave, what kind of society actually developed there? And this Exhibit C that you're seeing here is a constitution for the Chevy Chase Citizens Association. Now, in this Jim Crow period in which these developments are taking off in Chevy Chase, DC, the inhabitants organized for themselves citizens associations, and they organized them in the tradition of Jim Crow. So this document here is dated 1962, but it has, for our purposes, the same clauses in it going back to its origins in 1909. When the first Citizens Association for Chevy Chase DC was created. And you will see that one of those clauses is who is eligible for membership, next to this arrow here, the blue arrow. And to qualify for membership here, you had to be a white adult. All right, so what's interesting about this is that for most of the history in between 1920 and 1950, the Chevy Chase Citizens Association had a very aggressive membership drive in which they were able to impress or attract up to 3,000 members. Let that sink in, up to 3,000 members, all from Chevy Chase, as members of this association. So what that meant is that people were, joining an organization that was, by its constitution, all white. The wider implications of that were laid out in 1911, when the citizens associations band together to form a federation of citizens associations. And that was true across the city. Now, there were some associations that let in anybody. So it didn't matter whether you were African American, Asian, Hispanic, or white. you could be a member of these associations. And several of those associations applied to become members of the federation that was being set up, but they were turned down. And therefore, from 1921 on, there were 2 federations in Washington, D.C., down to just about 20 years ago, when there was a federation of citizens associations that was all white, and a federation of civic associations that was diverse, that let anybody in, no matter what their background was, all right? And so this is very recent when these racial designations actually changed. So this is something important to know about how the community was organized, and the kind of pressure, especially when you have 2,000 or 3,000 people joining it from within that community, what kind of pressure that exerted tendentially within the community. So let's go on and talk about who was actually in the community. Talk about the demographics, who populated the block and the neighborhood. So Exhibit D here is an enumeration sheet from the 1940 census. This is free. You can get this online. We have the reference for you at the end of the talk. This is the enumeration district 1, 274B, page 18. Each enumeration district has up to 35 or so pages. You have to find what the page you're interested in. And you can find an awful lot by going to these pages and seeing who was your neighbor. And on page 18 of this enumeration district, you can see that just so happens that on McKinley Street here, the first name is of Henry Fowler, and he's living at 3506 McKinley Street, our house. So he's the head of the house, and he's living with his daughter, Dorothy, and those are the only 2 people living in the house. He was married, but his wife died in 1933. You can see, his gender, male, female, his race or color, which is this column here, white, his age, his all sorts of other things about him. Also what he did. It says he was an attorney here, so what kind of job he had, and where he came from before living in DC. So you can learn an awful lot, whether there were lodgers, for instance, here at 3500 McKinley Street. You see there was a large household that had several lodgers in it. And I wanted to point out something about that household, because one of the people living in it, as you can see from this arrow, was not white. So W stands for white, and NEG stands for Negro or African American. And you can see that that person was a maid. Her name was Sadie Hughes. So at this point, domestic servants were either live-in, like Sadie Hughes, or they were living out, as the term would apply, and they commute from other places in the district or around to the household every day if they could find a way of doing that. But there were still many maids in the neighborhood. And in fact, the point that I want to make here is that I checked out the adjacent enumeration districts and looked at this one very carefully, and I can tell you from that research that the only African-American people left in this neighborhood were either live-in maids like Sadie Hughes, or the janitorial staff or housing engineers of the high-rise apartments on Connecticut Avenue. So the vision, the all-white vision that the developer had, was actually realized in the first generation, which was 1940 living in this neighborhood. So now we're back to that cluster of houses that I mentioned before at the very first slide. Here's again 3506 McKinley Street, right around the corner on Broad Branch Road, near the between between Northampton Street here and Patterson Street. You have this cluster of houses, and this was the Harris family, and Moten here was a Harris, Mary Harris Moten. Who were these people? These people were a family that had been free blacks in the antebellum period. They moved here sometime in the 1840s or 1850s, established themselves. They had sons, two of whom joined the Union Army and served in black regiments, were invalided, that is, they were wounded in combat. One of them died early because of that, and continued to live in this area until 1928. What happened in 1928? In 1928, the population of the development was getting so large that the schools that existed, E.V. Brown that I mentioned before, built in 1898, could no longer hold all the students, so new schools had to be built. And guess what happened? The people that were living in this land had their land taken by eminent domain by the city to build an all-white school. Now, the interesting point about the displacement of these African-American families, in addition to the unique circumstances that I already mentioned about the Harrises, is that this same Harris family were the descendants of a slave that was born in 1773, bought his freedom in 1790 from George Washington, worked with George Washington on the precursor to the C&O Canal. And it was his granddaughter who was the settler among these Harrises. So we're talking about the arc of American history being represented essentially around the corner from 3506 McKinley Street in this story of dispossession at the height of Jim Crow. Here is a house that we think Mary Moten lived in. It was this picture, not the caption, but the picture was actually discovered by a group of high school students that were hired during the bicentennial years when Washington, D.C. was offering high school kids summer jobs. And some of them in Chevy Chase, D.C. were hired as local historians to develop the history of their neighborhood. And it was in these documents, Origins and Origins 2, that picture that we just saw was documented, and it gave us one of our first leads in historic Chevy Chase, DC, 20 years later, to begin developing the history that we have now unearthed and are sharing with you. And I'll get back to that, but before I do, let me just turn to another question for a second about that you might be interested in if you're doing your own house history. And that is, of course, who lived in the house before you? Here are all of the people that lived in this house. We were able, through mortgage documents online and through building documents and the census that I just showed you before, to establish who these people actually were. I'm just going to mention two of them. One of them was Julia Monk Landis, and Julia and Jeff Landis lived here between 1997 and 2010 when we bought the house from them. Julia and Jeff both are, or were in Jeff's case, architects and designers. And they were deeply steeped in the style developments around the turn of the century and loved the arts and crafts movement. And when they moved here, they meticulously reestablished the whole feel of the bungalow with the furniture that would have been uniquely appropriate to it from the turn of the century, inspired by people like Gustav Stickley, who launched this journal, The Craftsman, taking ideas that came from Britain, from William Morris and before him, other people that were adivars of the craftsman, arts and crafts movement. So Gustav Stickley launched this in 1901. He had a furniture company, and this very furniture that you're seeing from the Zillow photograph of our house is the Stickley furniture that Julia allowed us to buy from her to preserve this very special feel of the house. So thank you, Julia. And Julia was with us, by the way, from Hong Kong in our Zoom meeting a few days ago when we ran this live. And that was a very special moment for me. I wanted to also draw your attention to Henry Fowler, who lived as a family between 1927 and 1991. Henry Fowler himself died in 1976 in this house, but his widow continued until 1991. And so the family was there for over 60 years, by far the longest duration inhabitants of the house. So who was Henry Fowler after all? Well, Henry Fowler was a real association guy. He was a graduate of Georgetown University Law School in 1915, began to establish a family law practice right after his graduation, but that was interrupted by America at war. And he had the good fortune, I guess, to work directly with General Pershing, the commander of the American Expeditionary Force, at his headquarters in Chaumont, France. So when the war was over, they came back. As I said before, Pershing actually lived in the neighborhood at the Corbin estate for a while, and Henry Fowler moved here in 1927, about the time that Pershing was here. Fowler was a real joiner. He was a member of an outdoor, club, a community canoe club. He was the member of veterans associations, and from the early 1930s, he belonged to the Chevy Chase Citizens Association. Next door, the membership secretary for that organization lived, a fellow by the name of Grinnell, and I'm sure the proximity was one of the factors that led Fowler to join if he needed any encouragement at all. But in 1945, Fowler was catapulted into the presidency of this very important organization. And he served as president for 2 years and as the delegate for the Chevy Chase Citizens Association, the one with the greatest number of members citywide of any citizens association, to the Federations of Citizens Association for about 15 years. In other words, until about 1962. So he was very active until very late in life. And remember what kind of citizens association that was. It was an all-white institution. So this was important. And the Citizens Association, I wanted to make one point about the Citizens Association before going any further, getting back to my narrative. And that point is simply this. Home rule in Washington, D.C. was established in the wake of the Civil War. And when Reconstruction was finished in 1876 or thereabouts, home rule was discontinued in Washington, D.C. And the city went over to a commission form of government where the President of the United States appointed 3 commissioners to run the city, along with the committees of Congress. Home rule wasn't reestablished in Washington, D.C. until 1974, as you probably know. In that whole century, the only representative body in Washington, D.C., in a city where no one could vote for anything, were the local citizens associations. So they had a very important role to play in the relationship between the citizen on the one hand and the running of the city on the other. So the fact that Fowler had such an important, prominent role in this was an important facet of my predecessors in the House. Now, the fact that we were in the high point of Jim Crow up until the early 1950s was not to say that everybody agreed with racial segregation. They didn't. Even if you were a member of this association, there was great pressure to become a member. You didn't necessarily buy into the concept. And here are 2 examples of that. So Walter Trubriner was the head of the school board in Washington when the Supreme Court handed down the decision, Brown versus Board of Education, that desegregated the schools in the United States, the public schools. And this is Trubriner a little bit later in 1964, a whole decade later, excoriating the federation, the segregated federation that I mentioned before of white citizens associations, for not allowing the membership of an association that was not segregated. So that was 1964. That's one person. And by the way, Trubriner lived around the corner on Rittenhouse Street. And Trubriner, after that, was appointed by President Kennedy as the last commissioner mayor of Washington, D.C. in 1961, I believe it was. So he served in that post for a while and then became ambassador to Jamaica, Trubriner did. And he lived around the corner on Rittenhouse Street. Then there was the Reverend James Reeb, who was a civil rights activist and minister at the Universalist Church here in Washington, D.C., and lived around the corner at 5700 Chevy Chase Parkway, which is less than 200 yards from where we're living, right? And he had a tragic end. The Reverend Reeb was with Martin Luther King at the Selma, Alabama protest in 1965 and was murdered by white supremacists for his participation in that protest with the other civil rights leaders. So things were changing, and the neighborhood was evolving for reasons that we can talk about later if you prefer. So my last slide raises the question here, or penultimate slide. Now that you know what your house is and what kind of neighbors you had and who lived in your house before and what kind of neighborhood it was, what do you do with that knowledge? I just wanted to point out something that Historic Chevy Chase DC is involved in, starting with pointing out this person here, a very distinguished individual, not only because he's wearing a very cool dashiki, but this is James Fisher. And James Fisher happens to be the direct descendant of Captain George Poynter, that freed slave that worked with George Washington that I mentioned before, who was the ancestor of those free blacks that were living on Broad Branch Road, who were dispossessed in 1928 through eminent domain to build an all-white school. And this picture shows James together with his genealogist partner who is working in developing this history, and our own historian, all three on the board of directors of Historic Chevy Chase, DC. But this is Tim Hannibal here, who in 1976 was working with those high school kids on developing the prototype for this whole narrative that we're developing now. And what you're looking at is a picture that was taken just 2 months ago, or 3 months ago now, at Lafayette Elementary School, when James talked to about 100 fourth and fifth graders about this history. Now just think of that. This was an awesome moment for those kids, because the person that they were talking to exemplified the entire arc of the history of this country, and they were able to connect to him. A very special moment for all of us, but for those kids in particular. This is James taking, in this picture, participating in the presentation that we made last July to the Advisory Neighborhood Commission based on 500 signatures on a petition to change the name of Lafayette Park and Recreation Center adjacent to the school to Lafayette Poynter Park and Recreation Center. Based on our testimony and the petitions that we handed over and the excellent briefing book that Tim created for the event, the ANC voted unanimously to support this proposal. Of course, the story isn't over, because any change of name of a property of the city has to be adopted by the city council. And so we are now working with the city council for the latest stage of that process. So thank you very much for your attention to this story. I hope you found it interesting. Here are some essential links. This one on top leads you to a whole set of links on researching your house that are online from the Washingtoniana collection of the MLK Library. Here's one that will get you to the 1940 census. Don't forget our website, which we've just relaunched, Historic Chevy Chase DC, because we have a wealth of information that will be helpful to you. And this is just a fun one of an artist who is interested in neighborhood history. Thank you, and we're ready to take some questions.
Carl, thank you very much for that. It was interesting and informative. On May 12th, we had several questions, and I wanted to ask you some of them now to expand on points that were of interest to the group of people we had. Before I do that, I think you may have misspoke when I had the sense that what you said was that George Poynter had been a slave of George Washington, but he in fact was a slave and had bought his freedom, but not from George Washington. Is that correct?
That's true. Yes, I misspoke.
Great, thank you. So one question was about Chevy Chase Circle. It's right at the Washington, Maryland line. Was that part of the development, or what? How did that get to be there?
The fountain.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry, just in here. Yeah, so the fountain was actually created in 1933. It was a memorial, so what didn't exist when Chevy Chase was being developed. That's very clear from the pictures that we have. They're all there, that show just a flat surface.
Well, in fact, there were trolley tracks that probably went through it.
I think the trolley went around. I don't think
Okay.
through. Um, but in any event, it was a memorial to Francis G. Newlands, and it took this memorial to him took the form of a fountain because his main contribution as a progressive was to mobilize the resources of the federal government in order to get water resources to arid regions, in particular in Nevada, but not just in Nevada, right? So it was seen as being very fitting to have something associated with water being his memorial. And by an act of Congress, this memorial was created, the Francis G. Newlands Memorial Fountain. And there were dignitaries on hand to open it, to turn it on, and whatnot in 1933, including his widow, his second wife, Elizabeth McAllister.
And so, the fountain is named after Francis Newlands, who, despite being an advocate for water, was also the builder of a racially limited neighborhood. Has the fountain been subject to the controversy that some of the Confederate monuments have?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Yes, in fact, there was a lively exchange on the Chevy Chase listserv in 2014, 2015, at the height of the Black Lives Matter movement, that whether or not the name of the fountain should in fact be changed. Or, I mean, there were several proposals that were put forward at this time. One of them was to simply put signage up that would reflect the racial exclusions that applied to the neighborhood. Leave the fountain the way it was, and to use the plaque that refers to Newlands as a teaching device, along with new signage that would explain the context.
But that's all led to nothing concrete yet,
So to speak.
so to speak. A different question, Carl. You've talked a lot about the racial exclusion that was in this neighborhood at its founding. Were there restrictions on other religious groups or other minority groups?
Yeah, I mean, the period was a period of false science in a way, right? So progressivism was about mobilizing science to support public administration. But what happens when the science is a little off? So there was a concern about the gene pool at the time. And couldn't we do something about controlling the population as a way of engendering public health, so we had this whole, development that was connected to racial ideology. And our whole immigration system was also organized around this as well. So there are different categories depending on what, ethnic or racial background you were. If you were from China, you had a problem. If you were Japan, you had a problem. Mexicans were seen in different ways. Blacks, of course, internally in the United States were, seen as racially inferior. So there was a hierarchy of race that also extended to our immigration system. People from Southern Europe were treated different from people from the Nordic countries in Europe, and different from the Eastern Europeans, and different from Hebraic people, as they were called at the time, and for immigration purposes. So this is the context, right, in which all of this was unfolding. And so the answer is clearly yes, people were alive to this. And if you were trying to organize, the perfect social environment, then these ideas fed into that. And so Jewish people had a hard time as well, specifically in Chevy Chase. It was hard if you were Jewish to buy a property in Chevy Chase. I know personally from talking to people anecdotally who had families that were kept out of, for instance, the Chevy Chase Country Club because they were Jewish until relatively recently. That hasn't been an issue maybe in the generation that we're living in, but in past generations that had certainly been an issue. So the answer is yes, there were other exclusions too.
Carl, you showed a page of the articles of the Chevy Chase Citizens Association from, I think it was the 60s, when they it appeared to be editing out the membership requirement that you be a white adult. Is the Citizen Association continues today, and what's the nature of any of these issues today?
Yeah, to our credit, we met. When you have the most successful one, it's hard to change, right? And as I said, there were up to 3,000 members in this association, and they thought they were doing the right thing. They must have been doing something right. They had a lot of membership, they probably were thinking. And it took a while for them to work their way out of that. If we go back to the history, to the to the beginnings really, 1920s and 30s, the changes were really associated with the migration into DC from elsewhere. That happened as the federal government took off in terms of its increasing numbers. Not only the Defense Department, but other, parts of the federal government. First, as an artifact of the development of the regulatory state, right? So even before, as Chevy Chase DC was just beginning, this is the beginning of the deep state, if you will. And the federal government got more numerous. Then the war broke out, and you had more people coming in for that. And then the New Deal created a whole new set of agencies that drew even more people, and they were coming from everywhere. And although this was a city located in the South, it was also a city in which all of the states had equities. And so people coming from all the different states had their own beliefs to represent. And a lot of them did not buy at all the whole segregated tradition of the South. And many of them were vocal about it. Sports announcers like Shirley Povich were among them, right? So
the Citizens Associations today is a very different organization.
Yeah, so the point that I was trying to make, thanks for intervening to help me along, but the point that I was trying to make is that it was already beginning to change from within, if you will, and it took some help from the outside to do that. But by the 1970s, this change, it was obvious that change had to come. The group did reform itself. It changed its constitution finally. And the proof of the pudding, I guess, is that we've had now 3 African-American presidents of that association, beginning with one of the Tuskegee Airmen who lived in our neighborhood, that is George Haley. He was the first officer and then president of the Chevy Chase Citizens Association in the late 70s, early 80s. He was followed by Doris Ingram in the 1990s. And then from, I think it was 2004 to 2006, Ed Hayes was the 3rd African-American to serve as president of the Chevy Chase Citizens Association. So from that point of view, good things have happened in the meantime.
Let me ask you a couple other questions, Carl, and then we can wrap up. One was the effort to rename the Lafayette Park and Rec Center to include George Pointer's name. Does that extend to the school as well or not?
No, it didn't extend to the school. I mean, you know, Historic WJSDC uh, Board of Directors in a meeting um, contemplated what we should be asking for, and the reason that we decided that we were focusing on the Park and Recreation Center is that the Park and Recreation Center was being renovated at the time. And it gave us an opening to create a campaign focusing on that. Nothing was happening to the school, that had already been done. So our opening was for the Park and Recreation Center. If the school was on, open for that, we probably would have done it for the school as well, but it wasn't.
Well, and I think too, looking at the map you were sharing with us, I think that the Harris and Moten families actually lived on the part of that parcel that is, in fact, the Park and Recreation Center. And the school was sort of outside that tiny neighborhood you showed us. In respect to the dispossession of that neighborhood, during our live event, several people were asking about other parts of the Northwest DC where there were similar dispossessions in the 1920s of what had been African American or mixed neighborhoods. Can you talk about that a little bit, or what some of those others were?
Yeah, here's where I invite you to be with us for the next event that we're doing in this format. We have with us Derek Musgrove on the 16th of June, and the point of that discussion will be to place Chevy Chase in the broader context of what was happening elsewhere in the city. And of course, as the city grew in population and as it suburbanized, the same issues that we dealt with in Chevy Chase, DC were affecting other neighborhoods as well. But our research so far has focused on our own neighborhood, and we haven't really gotten around to doing that. We hope that Professor Musgrove will have some answers for us there.
Well, his 2017 book, Chocolate City, is an excellent history of both race and democracy in the district. With his co-author, Chris Ash, they've done a masterful job, and anyone who lives in the city probably should read it. Those are the questions I have, Carl, so thank you very, very much. For listeners who have stayed with us through this recreation of our May 12th event, let me invite you, if you have additional questions, to email us at hccdc@comcast.net. But you can also visit our newly rebuilt website, where we both have resources on how to do research on house histories, but also a wide array of other information, including on the history of George Pointer and the effort to rename the park. But we've got a collection of over 30 oral histories. We've got some of the research that was done to support the naming of the creation of a historic district, which is no longer on the agenda, but this history was done by some professional urban historians. If you have ideas for future events like this that you'd like to share with us, please send us an email. And then most importantly, if you are so interested in these topics as to stayed with us through this video, I wish you'd also consider becoming a member of HCCDC. Our dues are tiny, only $25 a year, but our activities really depend on community support. If you want to also help us, we also depend on volunteers to do our projects, and we welcome you to join the board members and others who are friends of HCCDC. So until June 16th, when our next event will be, you can look at our website for the details and the Zoom link. Thank you all very, very much for participating in this rebroadcast.